On the 18th of April, 1942, 16 American bombers dropped roughly 16 tons of ordnance on Tokyo and 5 other Japanese cities, and by the next sunrise, every one of those aircraft had been destroyed. Not a single one reached a friendly airfield. The man who led the mission, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, spent that night sitting in the wreckage of his own bomber in a Chinese rice paddy, fully convinced he would be court-martialed the moment he got home. What waited for him instead was the Medal of Honor. This is the story of how the least destructive air raid of the entire Pacific War turned into one of the most consequential attacks of the 20th century. A strike that killed fewer than 100 people and did damage a modern nation could repair in a matter of weeks, dragged the Imperial Japanese Navy into the worst defeat in its history. It pinned hundreds of Japanese aircraft uselessly at home for 2 years, guarding against a raid that had barely scratched the country. And it triggered a reprisal thousands of miles from Tokyo that may have cost 250,000 lives. The Doolittle Raid stands as the clearest case in the whole war of an attack whose physical result and whose historical result have almost nothing in common. And the size of that gap is exactly what this story is about. To grasp why 16 medium bombers could matter this much, you first have to understand where the United States stood in the winter of 1941 and 1942, because this raid was not born out of strength. It grew out of a run of defeats so unbroken that the country needed, more than almost anything else, one piece of proof that Japan could be hit at all. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, the news landing on American desks stayed relentlessly bad. Wake fell, Guam fell, the Philippines were collapsing, and the Dutch East Indies were being overrun. Everywhere the war touched Japan, the Allied line kept sliding backward, and that psychological wound cut as deep as the loss of any single island. A nation that believes its enemy cannot be touched fights very differently from one that has watched bombs fall on the enemy's capital, and Roosevelt understood the difference. His demand for a reply came as much from a need for morale as from any hunger for steel. On the 21st of December, 1941, the president told the Joint Chiefs of Staff that Japan should be bombed as soon as it could possibly be arranged, and right there the wish slammed into geography. Japan sat behind thousands of miles of open ocean, and the United States held no land base close enough for a bomber to take off, strike Tokyo, and come back. The ordinary tools of air power simply did not reach that far. Any answer would have to be strange enough to sound absurd, which is exactly why the officer who eventually proposed it had to watch it with his own eyes before he trusted it. That answer came from a naval officer named Captain Francis Lowe. On the 10th of January, 1942, Lowe carried an idea to Admiral Ernest King. He had been down at Norfolk, where the outline of a carrier deck was painted onto a runway, so carrier pilots could practice their approaches, and he had watched twin-engine aircraft pass over that painted deck. The image lodged in his mind and produced a question no one had seriously asked before. If a carrier could not launch an aircraft with the range to reach Japan and return, then perhaps an Army medium bomber, a machine never meant to go anywhere near a ship, might lift off from a carrier's deck and fly that distance on its own. The question climbed the chain to General Henry Arnold, head of the Army Air Forces, and Arnold handed it to precisely the right man, which mattered enormously, because before this raid was anything else, it was an engineering problem, and the wrong leader would have solved it the wrong way. James Doolittle was no conventional officer. Racing planes had made him famous, test flying had nearly killed him more than once, and rarest of all for a man in a cockpit, he held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. When the Army needed someone who could stare at an impossible-sounding mission and work out whether it was merely very difficult, Doolittle was the one who ran the numbers. He treated the raid not as a stunt, but as a set of hard constraints waiting to be satisfied, and the constraint that ruled all the others was range. The arithmetic was brutal, and it forgave nothing. The mission aircraft had to cross roughly 2,400 nautical miles carrying a full ton of bombs, and that single figure dictated every other choice. Doolittle measured his candidates: the B-25 Mitchell, the B-26 Marauder, the B-18 BOLO, and the 23 Dragon, against the hardest requirement of all, which turned out to be neither speed nor bomb load, but the raw ability to clear a carrier deck. Only the B-25 had a wingspan and a takeoff run that could fit that deck. That one physical fact, wingspan set against deck width, knocked out every rival before detailed planning even began. On the 3rd of February, 1942, two B-25s lifted off the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet near Norfolk, and they cleared it cleanly. That flight was the proof the entire concept rested on, and on the strength of it the raid won approval that very same day. Everything that followed was refinement of a problem that had just been shown to have a solution. What Doolittle did next would be instantly familiar to a modern Formula One engineer, because it is the same discipline aimed at a different machine. He went to war against weight. In a mission ruled by fuel, every pound of aircraft that did not help the plane fly farther or hit harder was a pound of fuel it could not carry, and fuel was the whole mission. Nowhere in the equation was there any slack. And that is why the bombers came apart down to their essentials. Out went the belly gun turret. Out went the heavy liaison radio, and extra fuel tanks filled the emptied spaces until capacity nearly doubled, climbing from 646 gallons to 1,140. Consider what that trade actually admits. Doolittle knowingly weakened his aircraft's ability to defend itself and to talk to the outside world in order to buy range, because range meant survival and firepower did not. This is the exact logic that rules a race car built right up against a weight limit, where fuel load and payload sit at opposite ends of the same scale, and every gram handed to one is a gram stolen from the other. An engineer never asks what would be nice to have. An engineer asks what the mission cannot succeed without, and throws the rest over the side. Doolittle threw guns over the side to buy miles. The stripping ran further still, into something close to comedy, and the joke is worth telling because it shows how total the obsession with weight and secrecy had become. Crews pulled the tail guns out and replaced them with two broomsticks, painted black, poking out the back to pass for machine guns. It was pure bluff, a defensive capability fake because the genuine article cost weight the mission could not spare. And the astonishing part is that the bluff worked, by Doolittle's own later account, because not one aircraft attacked his bombers directly from behind. The mere appearance of a rear gun was enough to change how the enemy behaved, a lesson that reaches far past aviation into any contest where the look of a defense can stand in for the defense itself. The bombsight told a different version of the same story. The Norden bombsight ranked among America's most closely guarded secrets, a precision instrument worth around $10,000. And it handed Doolittle two problems at once. It was far too valuable to risk in the near-certain crash landing at the end of a one-way flight, and it was useless anyway down at the treetop altitude these crews would fly, since it had been built for bombing from high above. So one of the pilots, Captain Ross Greening, hammered together a replacement out of aluminum for about 20 cents and nicknamed it the Mark Twain, after the old riverboat call for measuring depth. A gadget costing 1/50,000th of the machine it replaced would aim the bombs that fell on Tokyo. The most secret instrument in the American arsenal stayed home, and a 20-cent scrap of bent metal did the job the mission actually needed. The whole raid, in miniature, lived in that willingness to toss aside the prestigious answer for the one that fit the constraints. The crews came out of the 17th Bombardment Group, every one of them a volunteer, and they volunteered blind. All anyone told them was that the mission would be extremely hazardous and extremely secret, nothing about what it was or where it would go. That detail deserves a pause, because 80 men signed on to a one-way flight whose shape they were not allowed to know, and they did it on trust alone. Through March of 1942, they trained at Eglin Field in Florida, where a Navy officer named Lieutenant Henry Miller taught grown men, flying multi-ton Army bombers, to do the one thing those bombers were never designed for, which was to haul themselves into the air in a few hundred feet, about the length of a carrier deck. Every piece of their training pointed at the peculiar demands of this single mission. Short field takeoffs, because the deck ran short. Low-level flying, because they would slip in beneath the radar. Night navigation and long crossings over open water, because they would come off the target with no landmarks and a fuel needle already dropping toward empty. This was not general preparation for war. It was rehearsal for one flight that had never been attempted. 80 airmen were chosen, 5 to a plane, across 16 aircraft. On the 2nd of April, 1942, the aircraft carrier Hornet, under Captain Mark Mitcher, steamed out beneath the Golden Gate Bridge with all 16 B-25s lashed to her flight deck in plain sight. She sailed as Task Force 18. The bombers were far too big to fit below, so there was no hiding them, and anyone watching the Hornet leave San Francisco saw Army bombers riding a Navy carrier, an impossible pairing, and could only guess at what it meant. 6 days later, on the 8th of April, Vice Admiral William Halsey brought the carrier Enterprise out of Pearl Harbor as Task Force 16, and on the 13th the two groups met at sea and merged under Halsey's command. Halsey's signal to the combined fleet ran only 4 words long. This force is bound for Tokyo. In that instant, 10,000 sailors spread across 2 carriers, 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, 2 oilers, and 2 submarines finally learned what they had sailed into. One detail from those hours deserves to be sat with, because it captures the strange emotional weather of the moment better than any statistic could. Before the launch, someone brought out medals, Japanese friendship medals, the awards Japan had handed to American servicemen back in the years before the war, when the two countries were still nominally at peace. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had set the gesture in motion. Crews wired those medals to the bombs so they could be, in a grim turn of phrase, returned to their senders. Think for a moment about what that object carried. A token of goodwill between two nations, given in peacetime, now bolted to a 500-pound bomb and pointed back at the city it came from. Men once handed symbols of friendship were now sending them back at terminal velocity, and the whole collapse of the pre-war relationship sits compressed inside that one wired-on metal. The plan lived or died on a single number, and that number was distance. The carriers were meant to creep within roughly 400 to 450 nautical miles of Japan before launching, and that figure was no arbitrary choice. It marked the exact range at which the stripped, overloaded bombers carried just enough fuel to reach their targets, cross Japan, and limp onto airfields in nationalist-held China, where friendly ground crews were supposed to guide them down and refuel them for the final leg to Chongqing. Every mile the carriers fell short of that launch point was a mile carved straight off the far end of the flight, over China, in the dark, with the tanks already running low. The China plan itself had already cost someone dearly. Chiang Kai-shek had agreed to provide those landing fields despite dreading exactly the kind of retribution such a raid would call down on him, a dread that would prove justified on a scale almost past comprehension. The alternative had been closed off before it opened. Doolittle had first hoped to land near Vladivostok and hand the bombers to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, which would have shortened the flight by around 600 nautical miles and eased the whole fuel problem. But the Soviets refused. Bound by a neutrality pact with Japan, they would not break for an American raid. China had had to be, with no margin left to spare. And that is when the plan broke, the way fuel-critical plans always break, early and at the worst possible moment. Around 7:38 on the morning of the 18th of April, the task force was spotted. A small Japanese picket boat, number 23 Nitto Maru, a vessel of maybe 70 to 90 tons, caught sight of the American ships roughly 650 nautical miles out and got a radio warning off before the cruiser Nashville sent it to the bottom. The message went straight into the Japanese command network. Enemy carriers sighted, 600 nautical miles east of Inuyabosaki. Here is the contrarian truth that most tellings quietly soften into triumph. The Doolittle Raid, as it was actually flown, was not the mission anyone had planned. It was a compromised, degraded version launched in crisis, and the crisis was one of fuel, not of enemy fighters. The bombers left the deck about 150 to 170 nautical miles farther from Japan than intended, and roughly 10 hours ahead of schedule. Every one of those extra miles was fuel that would not be waiting on the far end, over China, in the dark, at the moment it mattered most. That little picket boat never stopped the raid and never shot down a single aircraft. What its radio did was quietly guarantee, in advance, that all 16 bombers would run their tanks dry before they could reach safety, turning a difficult one-way mission into a near-certain loss of every airframe. That reframes the decision Halsey and Doolittle then made. They understood the fuel math. They knew that launching from this far out meant the crews would very likely never reach the Chinese fields. The choice in front of them was never between a clean mission and a compromised one. It was between calling the whole thing off to protect the aircraft and the crew's slim margin of survival, or spending that margin for the chance to strike Tokyo at all. They chose the strike, and they chose it in minutes. That is the real decision at the heart of the Doolittle Raid, not the flying itself, but the willingness to trade the crew's safety like currency the instant the plan came apart. Halsey gave the order, and Doolittle went first, with 467 feet of deck in front of him and an aircraft heavier than any B-25 ever flown off a carrier before. Between roughly 8:20 and 9:19, all 16 bombers clawed their way off the Hornet, formed up, and turned toward the home islands of an empire that did not believe they could ever be touched. They came in low, around midday Tokyo time, on the 18th of April, 1942. The targets were military and industrial, exactly as the crews had been briefed: the oil tank farms, a steel mill, power plants, and factories. At Yokosuka, a bomb from Lieutenant Edgar McElroy's aircraft struck a ship under conversion, the Ryuho, tearing a hole in her and shoving her completion date back to November. Across Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka, the bombs came down, and the wail of air raid sirens in the capital of an empire that had promised its people the home islands could never be reached did work no single bomb could ever accomplish. Now come the numbers that define this raid, because the entire meaning of the Doolittle mission lives in the gap between two of them. In purely military terms, the physical damage amounted to almost nothing. For years, the death toll was reported at around 50 people killed. The historian James Scott, working from Japanese damage records that survived the fire raids of 1945 and from research by the Japanese historians Takehiko Shibata and Katsuro Hara, filled in the fuller picture. The raid destroyed 112 buildings and damaged 53, killed 87 men, women, and children, left 151 seriously injured, and inflicted minor injuries on at least 311 more. Set those two versions side by side, the old figure of roughly 50 killed and Scott's revised 87, and notice that even the higher, better-sourced number stays militarily trivial against a modern industrial nation of tens of millions. In the coldest accounting, this was a pinprick. 100-odd buildings out of an entire country. Fewer than 90 dead in a war that would eventually kill millions. Measured the way you would measure a bombing campaign, by tonnage and destruction, you would file this raid under failure and move on. That is the trap, and it is exactly why the raid is so badly misread by anyone who counts only the buildings. There is a thread here that Japanese propaganda seized on. One historian's long waved away as pure invention, and the honest answer turns out to be far more uncomfortable than either side wanted it to be. The crews had been briefed, over and over, to steer clear of anything that was not a military target. By Doolittle's own account, his men were told to keep away from hospitals, schools, and museums, and there is no reason to doubt the intent behind that order. But Doolittle also stated something every air campaign in history has been forced to face, and he said it plainly, that it is quite impossible to bomb a military objective with civilian homes nearby without endangering those homes, and that this is simply a hazard of war. Scott's review of the surviving Japanese records confirmed that real, unintended casualties did occur inside schools and a hospital, some of them caused by bombs the raid's own aircraft dropped. So the propaganda charge of indiscriminate bombing was not a clean fabrication. It described, in loaded language, the ordinary and terrible arithmetic of dropping bombs on cities where military targets and civilian life tangled together in the same streets. The crews aimed at factories and struck some of them. They also, without meaning to, killed children. Both things are true at once, and a serious history holds them together rather than picking whichever one flatters more. The raid was aimed at military targets. The raid also killed civilians nowhere near a military target. That is no contradiction. That is what bombing a city is. Then came the night, and the bill for those extra miles fell due exactly as the fuel math had warned it would. 15 of the 16 bombers ran for China through worsening weather and failing light, and one after another their fuel gave out over unfamiliar mountains. Crews bailed into the darkness or ditched along the coast. 3 men died in the process: Corporal Leland Factor during his bailout, and Sergeants William Dieter and Donald Fitzmaurice, who drowned when their aircraft went into the water. The 16th bomber, flown by Captain Edward York, had burned fuel at a rate that put China flatly out of reach, and York took the only option left to him and turned for the Soviet Union, landing near Vladivostok. There the neutral Soviets did precisely what neutrality demanded, confiscating the bomber and interning the 5-man crew, who would not get free until a long, quiet passage through Iran more than a year later. The men who came down inside China fell into 2 very different fates, and the whole difference between them came down to geography, to who reached them first. Most were found first by Chinese civilians and soldiers, and this sits at the very center of the story. Ordinary people in the provinces where the airmen landed hid them, carried them, fed them, and smuggled them out from under the noses of Japanese patrols at enormous personal risk. Of the 75 airmen aboard the 15 China-bound planes, 64 were carried to safety by the Chinese people. The raid got most of its men out alive only because thousands of Chinese civilians chose to shield them. And holding on to that fact is not sentimentality. It is the setup for the darkest turn in the whole account, because Japan understood perfectly well who had saved the airmen. Staff Sergeant David Thatcher earned the Silver Star for keeping the badly injured crew of one bomber alive through the aftermath of its crash. That crew's pilot, Captain Ted Lawson, had lost a leg in the wreck, and the flight surgeon, Lieutenant Thomas White, who had trained as a gunner for the express purpose of putting a doctor aboard the mission, performed the amputation. Lawson would later write the account that became 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which is how much of the American public first met this story. But 8 airmen came down where the Japanese reached them first, and for those 8 the war stopped being a mission and hardened into a captivity. After a show trial, all 8 captured airmen were sentenced to death. 5 of those sentences were commuted. 3 were not. On the 15th of October, 1942, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz were executed by firing squad in Shanghai. A 4th prisoner, Lieutenant Robert Meader, died in captivity on the 1st of December, 1943, of malnutrition. The remaining 4 held on until liberation in August of 1945, enduring roughly 40 months of imprisonment, much of it in solitary confinement. One of those 4 was Corporal Jacob DeShazer, and his story runs somewhere no war narrative ever expects to go. Inside his prison cell, DeShazer was handed a Bible, and he converted. After the war, he returned to Japan, not as a bombardier, but as a Christian missionary. And among the people he sought out and reconciled with was Mitsuo Fukuda, the pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. One of the men who bombed Japan went back to spend his life there in peace, closing a circle with the man who had opened the war between their 2 countries. That is no screenwriter's invention. That is the documented arc of one of the 80. Now we reach the reason this raid belongs in any serious conversation about the entire war, and not merely in some catalog of daring missions. Everything up to this point, the 16 aircraft, the 80 men, the 100-odd buildings, stays small. What the raid did to the mind of the Japanese high command was not small at all. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had spent months pressing inside the Japanese command for a decisive strike against the American carriers at Midway. His obstacle was never really the enemy. It was consensus at home. The Army General Staff and the Navy General Staff both harbored reservations about flinging the fleet that far forward, and Yamamoto had not managed to fully override that caution. He held the argument, but not yet the unanswerable case. And then, on the 18th of April, American bombers appeared over Tokyo, over the capital, over the home islands that Japanese strategy had sworn would never be touched, the very premise the entire Pacific perimeter had been built and bled for. By several accounts, Yamamoto was physically sickened by the news and withdrew to his cabin for days. The Naval History and Heritage Command records flatly that he became ill and incapacitated when he heard. This is no metaphor about a general feeling upset. This is the commander of the entire fleet knocked out of function for days by an attack that had done almost no physical damage. What the raid did to the Japanese decision-making process would be recognized on sight by any modern organizational psychologist, because it is a pattern that repeats in institutions with nothing to do with war. It was not a military blow. It was a shock to institutional risk tolerance. Inside any large organization, one vivid, humiliating failure, a public breach, a headline disaster, can override months of careful, sober analysis and stampede the leadership towards some decisive-looking action the cautious voices had, right up to that moment, been successfully holding back. The failure does not have to be large to do this. It only has to be visible and humiliating enough to make caution feel like weakness. That is precisely what the Doolittle Raid did inside the Japanese command. It did not invent the Midway plan, which already existed and had essentially been decided. What it did was collapse the internal opposition to it. Once bombs had fallen on Tokyo, arguing for caution meant arguing that the fleet should sit back while the enemy struck the homeland at will, and no one could win that argument anymore. The humiliation made the aggressive option look like the only respectable one left. The raid hardened Yamamoto's resolve, silenced his doubters, and sped up the timetable of an operation that had been contentious just a week earlier. Here the honest historian has to hold two claims at the same time, and the discipline of holding both is what separates real history from a satisfying story. It overstates the case to say the Doolittle Raid caused the Battle of Midway, since the operation had already been largely decided before the bombers ever flew, and pretending the raid conjured it out of nothing is the kind of tidy cause-and-effect history rarely supplies. Yet it is well supported to say the raid hardened the resolve behind Midway and dissolved the resistance to it, driving the Imperial Navy to commit fully to the operation that, roughly 6 weeks later in the first week of June 1942, cost it 4 aircraft carriers and the strategic initiative in the Pacific for the rest of the war. The raid did not draw the map for Midway. It erased the last hesitations of the men holding the pen. A second, quieter cost to Japan rarely gets counted alongside those carriers, and it may be the purest illustration of the raid's disproportion. The shock of bombs over the homeland forced Japan to hold aircraft back for home defense. Fighter groups desperately needed in the brutal fighting to the south were kept in the home islands clear through 1942 and 1943, standing guard against a repeat of an attack that had, in material terms, barely scratched the country. Read that again in terms of cost and effect. A raid that destroyed roughly 100 buildings tied down entire fighter groups for 2 full years. The pinprick pinned resources in place far out of any proportion to the damage it had actually caused, and every one of those grounded fighters was a fighter absent from the places where the war was truly being decided. Now comes the part of this story the celebratory tellings tend to leave in shadow, because it is where the triumph turns to ash and stays there. The bombers had escaped into China. The men had been hidden and saved by Chinese villagers. 64 of the 75 China-bound airmen carried out alive by ordinary people who risked everything to do it. Japan understood exactly what that meant and exactly who had done it, and Japan answered the villages. Beginning around the 15th of May, 1942, and running into September, the Japanese launched the Zhujiangjiangxi campaign, a sweep through the very provinces where the airmen had come down and been sheltered. This was not a military operation aimed at an army. It was a punishment aimed at the population that had helped the raiders slip away. The scale of what followed lives inside a number that has to be handled with real care, because it comes down to us from wartime sources, and it is enormous. The figure most often cited is 250,000 Chinese killed, the overwhelming majority of them civilians. That number, around 250,000, traces back to wartime claimants, to Chiang Kai-shek, who reported the reprisals had cost his nation 250,000 lives, to General Claire Chennault, who set the figure down in his memoir, and to missionary reports coming out of the region while the killing was still underway. Historians including James Scott and Richard Frank have carried it forward since. The narrower estimates, counting individual districts, run into the tens of thousands. The full campaign civilian figure is that headline 250,000. It is an estimate, not a precise ledger, and it should always be spoken as one. But it is worth stating flatly that even at the conservative end of the range, the death toll of the reprisal dwarfs the death toll of the raid, it answered by a factor measured in thousands. The Japanese campaign carried something beyond soldiers into those provinces. Units tied to Japan's biological warfare program spread plague, cholera, and typhoid through the region. And the disease, by several accounts, refused to honor the line between attacker and victim. It turned back on the men who had loosed it and sickened thousands of Japanese troops, a weapon that could be launched but never aimed, killing on both sides of a war it was meant to serve. A documented and deeply uncomfortable thread runs through here as well. One James Scott drew out of long-forgotten missionary records held in a university archive, and it is the fact that complicates every clean celebration of the raid. Washington had reason to expect that a raid launched into China would bring reprisal crashing down on the Chinese people, and the raid was kept secret from China's population despite that expectation. The 80 men who flew to Tokyo did not order what happened in Zhejiang, and the moral weight of the reprisal belongs, first and last, to the forces that carried it out. But the 16 bombers did not come down in an empty landscape. They came down among people, and those people saved the airmen, and then paid for that mercy a price that dwarfed, by a factor of thousands, everyone the raid itself had killed in Japan. Any honest telling of the Doolittle Raid has to drag that number out of the shadow and set it down beside the goblets and the medals, because it is part of the very same event. Doolittle, sitting in the wreckage of his own bomber that first night in a Chinese field, was certain he had failed. 16 aircraft, all lost. Damage a nation could patch up inside a few weeks. By the only measure he had in front of him, planes lost weight against buildings destroyed, the mission looked like a disaster, and he fully expected a court-martial the moment he reached home. What he could not see, from the ground in the dark, was the machinery he had already set turning thousands of miles away inside the mind of the Japanese High Command. On the 28th of April, 1942, he was promoted straight to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel altogether. In June, Roosevelt pinned the Medal of Honor on him. Every one of the 80 raiders received the Distinguished Flying Cross, and those killed or wounded received the Purple Heart as well. When reporters pressed the president on where the bombers had come from, since admitting they had flown off a carrier would have handed Japan the method and killed any chance of repeating it, Roosevelt answered that they had come from Shangri-La, the hidden mountain paradise out of the novel Lost Horizon. The deflection came dressed as a joke, and the Navy liked it enough to name an aircraft carrier the Shangri-La, which Doolittle's own wife would christen. Now weigh the whole ledger, because the ledger is the argument. On one side, the raid killed fewer than 100 people in Japan and destroyed a little over 100 buildings. It cost the Americans all 16 aircraft, 3 men dead in the crashes, 3 executed by firing squad, 1 dead of malnutrition in a cell, and 5 interned by the Soviets, 7 of the 80 gone in the end. On the other side, it pulled the Imperial Navy toward Midway and the loss of 4 carriers, pinned Japanese fighter groups uselessly at home for 2 years, and brought down a reprisal on China that may have killed 250,000 people. No raid in the entire war returned a stranger ratio of physical damage done to history changed. The buildings were rebuilt inside the year. The consequences never stopped unfolding. The men themselves marked their bond with 80 engraved silver goblets, one for every raider, and at their reunions they toasted the dead and turned each fallen man's goblet upside down. Richard Cole, Doolittle's own co-pilot, was the last of them, dying in 2019 at the age of 103, and in 2022 the final goblet was turned over. In 2014, the surviving raiders received the Congressional Gold Medal. And in China, a memorial hall in Suzhou honors the villagers and the airmen together, the ones who fell out of the sky and the ones who paid for saving them. and the two nations still gather there to remember what happened. So here is the question the Doolittle Raid leaves sitting on the table decades after the last bomb fell. Measure a military action by the damage it does. And this was one of the smallest attacks of the entire Pacific War, 100 buildings and 87 dead in a war of millions. Measure it instead by what it changed, a navy pushed toward its ruin, 250,000 lives lost in reprisal, an empire's whole sense of its own safety shattered in a single afternoon, and it may rank among the largest. Which number, then, is the true size of the Doolittle Raid, the damage it did, or the history it moved?